After more than 3 years of conflict and civil war, earlier this week, Syria went to the polls. And while many question the legitimacy of these elections, Bashar al Assad won with an 88.7% majority. But what do the elections mean to the millions of Syrian refugees who fled the war?
Our reporter Priyanka Dutt traveled to Lebanon in the last week, to the heart of what is being called the biggest humanitarian crisis of our times. Now, Lebanon alone has more than 1 million Syrian refugees, and that number is growing daily.
But how are the refugees coping in terms of health, livelihood, and daily needs? And how are limited resources impacting aid and rehabilitation efforts on the ground? Priyanka Dutt has more.
It's a beautiful drive through the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. This is the eastern part of the country that shares a long, porous border with war-torn Syria. Over the last 3 years, 1,080,000 refugees have crossed the border and come into Lebanon. A number so huge, so incomprehensible in its magnitude, that it runs the risk of turning into a meaningless statistic. Until we entered this house. Omar's husband died in a rocket attack in Homs, and she fled here with her 6 children. In a single night, she turned into a refugee, a faceless statistic. But her story needs to be told, for it reflects all that needs attention in one of the biggest humanitarian crises of our times. Her eldest son, just 15, is now the sole bread earner in the family. He works at a factory all night, managing to make just enough to pay the rent.
مواد غذائية كتير غالية والخبز عندهم غالي وما بتحسن إلا تجيب يعني وغاز ومواد غذائية ما بتحسن يعني إلا أولاد بدها تاكل يعني 6 أولاد أنت بتعرف قديش معيشتهم صعبة وبلد مو بلدنا يعني.
And so for food and other necessities, the family still depends on aid. But there is a limit to what humanitarian aid can cover. So her youngest son, who needs to be operated for an infection, must wait. Her daughter, whose post-traumatic recurrent nightmares are now giving way to skin rashes, must wait. The United Nations Refugees Agencies that is coordinating relief on the ground just doesn't have the money, which means anything beyond basic essential aid must wait.
مجبورة إني أقوي حالي مشان أولادي. مجبورة. على طول معي انهيار عصبي من هالشغلات هاي. ما بحسن أقول إلا الله يصبرني مشان أولادي ما أكتر.
It's certainly an unprecedented situation. We have a very tiny country now that 25% of their populations is refugees, and it's having a very intense impact here. We're also facing a situation we simply don't have enough money in order to meet all humanitarian needs, let alone support Lebanon and Lebanese institutions in the manner that they really need to be supported in order to cope with this crisis. There simply is not a country in the world today who has more refugees proportion to its size than Lebanon, and Lebanon has shown incredible generosity in responding to this crisis.
With no end to the war in sight, more and more people are coming in every day. We're at the Tripoli Registration Center, one of the biggest registration centers that covers refugees coming into all of North Lebanon. In fact, every day, about 500 new refugees are registered right here at this hall behind me. That's just one center. Across the country, more than 2,000 people are being registered daily. And with aid drying up, the situation is getting more tense and desperate. Everywhere we go, we hear stories of illness, unemployment, and despair. Just last week, a woman tried to burn herself outside this very center. Now health workers on the ground are already worrying about copycat incidents.
It's created a trend throughout the rest of Lebanon, in which we have people approaching us, telling us that if we're removed from the food service, I mean, IMC, we're mental health and it's all provided, but especially the food and the shelter. If we can no longer get this assistance, then we will harm ourselves or harm our children because we can no longer feed them. And this is a very big cry to the international community.
الحاجة كبيرة جدا جدا. فنحن على أبواب شهر رمضان. هناك أكثر من 1,100,000 لاجئ في لبنان من السوريين وحوالي 60,000 لاجئ فلسطيني. الحاجات كثيرة. نتمنى استمرار الدعم لمواجهة أهم الحاجات الأساسية لهذه الأسر المنكوبة والنازحة.
The numbers are stark, from just 5,000 refugees in the summer of 2011 to an estimated 2 million by the end of the year. This in a country that's own population is just about 4.5 million. Resources are being squeezed beyond their natural limits. Behind me you can see the Del Hamia camp set up by the UNHCR for Syrian refugees. But the refugee situation in Lebanon is a little different from other countries in that about 82% of the refugees do not live in camps like these but are actually living all across the country in rented accommodation, some of them even living inside Lebanese homes.
Well, at the very outset, what's interesting is that Syrian refugees were hosted with Lebanese families. But today we're talking about villages that are overwhelmed, an infrastructure that is overwhelmed really by any standards. That is why today we're sensing some tensions between the hosting communities and refugees, and it is only normal to sense that.
And this is the biggest reason why rehabilitation and aid in Lebanon is a tough balancing act between helping Syrian refugees as well as empowering local Lebanese families who are also facing the brunt of scarce and stretched resources. In fact, Lebanese families are given incentives and their homes are renovated if they host refugee families. While the world looks on at the ongoing Syrian elections with interest, here on the ground in Lebanon, the outlook is bleak. For many refugees, it's their third summer outside their homes, with no telling when they'll go back. Even if they go back, they will have to rebuild their lives from scratch. For now, that's a worry left to the adults. For the children, there are other distractions.
Brazil!